Okay, hello everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you to everyone for showing up at 3:05 on day 3 of the conference. We really appreciate that you're still here. So what we're going to do today is have a panel discussion about digital commons. So I'll explain to you a little bit of the context about what we understand digital commons is. That is us as NGI Commons, a CSA that supports the implementation of the NGI program and EU public policy. So I'll explain a little bit what we mean by digital commons, why we're talking about kind of, quote, building blocks, which you'll see there in the subtitle, and why this is all very relevant in light of the recent focus on digital sovereignty by the European Commission. So a little bit more about NGI Commons. So this is kind of our disclaimer here at the beginning is we represent a coordination and support action that's designed to help improve and create coherence around policymaking and investment related to digital commons in the European Union. So this is a 36-month project that started in January 2024. And it's represented by these partners, including Martel Innovate, OpenForum Europe, which I represent, CNRS, the French Research Institute's Open Future Foundation, and the Linux Foundation, specifically the Linux Foundation Europe, which will be represented here on the panel. So, what are digital commons? Digital commons have many definitions. Through our research on behalf of the NGI Commons project, we have found that they generally refer to three things. Highly open digital resources, most commonly ones with an open license. This is a point of debate for us. Communities organized around those resources, and models for governance, access, and sharing which enable fair and equitable participation and use of the digital resource. Many of what we would call digital commons today are openly accessible, and famous examples, of course, include open source software, open data, but also open access science, even open hardware, and open content. So many of the things that you all will be familiar with. As digital commons are continually scaled and used as critical digital infrastructure, what we're hoping to use this session to unpack is how the obligations to those commons change as the development, adoption, and use of the commons grow, and specifically what the role of the public sector is supposed to be in those projects. In Europe, this is particularly important because of the increasing momentum and conversations happening around digital sovereignty in recent years, which has really taken off since 2023, 2024. In a policy sense, we understand digital sovereignty as the idea that the EU provided or open source digital alternatives can help increase European strategic autonomy in the digital realm and decrease reliance on large technology providers. But there's folks that take it all the way to the level of, quote, buy European. We see this push from the EuroStack initiative, an independent policy initiative, but this is also getting attention from the European Parliament and the European Commission. So digital commons, like open source software, frequently emerge as small community projects, and the more successful ones end up being recognized as infrastructure. This shouldn't be new news to any of you. Sometimes this is on a smaller scale, for example, in a city or region. Well, in many cases, it happens through global collaboration. Even things like platform cooperatives can be understood as digital commons, and some of those are very hyperlocal. To cite some examples, digital commons were created as early as the beginning of the 21st century and have grown to become crucial parts of the digital environment. Of course, examples include things like Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, or the Apache open source software. The proliferation of these resources as really true community resources is rooted in a strong academic literature, and now it's being applied in an EU public policy context, forcing us to really think about what the obligations of the public sector are to the governance, funding, support, and contribution to open technologies. For the European Commission, this focus has most recently manifested in the form of the so-called Open Internet Stack, which is being positioned as the successor to the NGI program. In contrast to the more bottom-up funding for grassroots innovation around open source software, which was provided by the NGI, the OAS seems at first glance to be something a little bit more deliberate, focused on the intentional nurturing and scale-up of digital commons, particularly OSS as part of digitally sovereign infrastructure for the EU and its member states. There is also the Digital Commons Edict, which is dedicated to nurturing new technologies such as sovereign digital workplaces as open source infrastructure for the EU institutions and EU member states. In this context, it's important for us to understand the potential of working with communities to develop new digital public services and products, but also as ways of supporting more decentralized innovation and value-based technological change. The Commission has not yet articulated to us a public theory of change, around the open internet stack, and more details seem to be forthcoming. But one of the proposed goals is to scale up digital commons as part of this infrastructure through an approach around building blocks. For our purposes, we understand those building blocks to be digital capabilities, either technical or non-technical, that support the provisioning of infrastructure and which have broad societal functions, particularly when used to deploy solutions at scale. In our role as NGI Commons, we've been advocating to the Commission that these capabilities should not just be software, but other capabilities which enable the public sector to leverage, deploy, and contribute to open technology projects in an inclusive and non-extractive way. So not just taking free software, for example, forking it and moving on. For us, this is a useful starting point for thinking about how to introduce classic fundamentals of open source software development and open source collaboration into the way the EU develops and sustains digital infrastructure. So it's unclear what happens or what comes next with the open internet stack, but this is us trying to put our best foot forward and say that we think that it's important to identify and surface technologies, but also ways of implementing those technologies that might make this inclusive and non-extractive form of software development and open technology contribution possible. So this was done initially by building on a structured mapping exercise we did, and we received substantial community input. It resulted in a draft table that I put in a brief that we wrote to the Commission outlining different categories of capabilities, both technical and non-technical. It's hoped that this will serve as an initial taxonomy and will be refined through surveys in the months ahead. So stay tuned to our website and social media channels for more updates. But really, it's a starting point for discovery. This is a little bit more focused on the artifacts, but you'll also see some non-technical capabilities down there. And what we'll really focus on is kind of the theory of change around kind of the community and governance side today. So just to give a few examples to make this a little bit more tangible for you all, one that you might have heard of and has been presented here at the 2025 Open Source Summit is OpenDesk. So this is the German side of a French-German collaboration. On the French side, it's called La Suite, and really what they're trying to do is scale up digital workspaces as a form of building block. This is actually receiving a substantial or possibly insubstantial contribution from the Digital Commons Edict. So really kind of polishing up this workspace as kind of a super commons of sort that brings together these different open source projects, bumping it up to enterprise scale, and really making it usable for the public sector. And there's some really interesting dynamics I saw in a presentation by the Center for Digital Sovereignty the other day explaining how they're doing that and how they engage with and develop this software through their open code platform, which is kind of more of a safe and regulated space for the public sector to engage in these commons projects. Matrix or element, this is an example of a messaging protocol, which I would consider a form of building block. It's being developed and maintained by the Matrix.org Foundation, and many people will interact with it through the Element web client. We also use Element at NGI Commons, and many grassroots projects do, but it's also being used by NATO. So there's a huge and tremendous kind of depth and reach, and it's really interesting to see many public sector institutions coming on board in those communities. Mastodon and PeerTube, needless to say, decentralized social media is receiving a lot of attention, and you can imagine kind of an EU-wide version of kind of social media that bundles together different capabilities as part of a larger project, which you could regard as a commons. But you might also see more active participation of the EU and its member states in these projects in the months and years ahead. So, in summary, building blocks, as I conceptualize them, are really just a policy mechanism for thinking about use cases for digital commons as infrastructure. What we really want at the end of the day is for open source software and other open technologies to be designed, deployed, and governed in an inclusive and non-extractive manner, with active participation in and stewardship of both existing and new open source projects and communities. In our panel discussion today, you're going to hear from a few people working in this space who will share concrete examples and emerging considerations for policymakers, as digital commons are, at least in theory, again, this is still all proposed, applied at scale for projects of common strategic interest. We're going to consider how this new interest by the public sector in open source digital commons as building blocks, what it means in terms of broader approaches to collaborating around software and other open technologies, but also how it's going to influence, hopefully, the EU's engagement with communities and in the governance of open source projects. So here today to discuss all of this, we have Adrienn Lawson from the Linux Foundation Europe and a member of the NGI Commons Consortium. And we also have Daniel Izquierdo Cortázar from Bitergia and the InterSource Commons Foundation. He's also a board member at the Chaos Project. So together with Adrienn and Daniel, we'll be discussing kind of less of the what, which is to say, we're not going to do too much speculation around what capabilities the commission should invest in, but much more on the how. How can we ensure that the lessons from the previous applications of open source in the public sector ensure that the likes of the Open Internet Stack and the Digital Commons Edict learn from previous failures and really nurture these digital commons projects with substantial private sector and community resourcing and contribution. So yeah, please join us in welcoming our panelists to the stage. So Adrienn, I want to start with you. Could you tell us from your perspective, what is the value that you think this idea of digital commons, and it is a contested one in the open source community, brings to the conversation around how to support and nurture open source software and other open technologies? Is thinking about OSS as a digital commons really that important?
Yes. I think I'm going to do a little bit of introduction.
Yeah.
So I come from the ALAF research side and working with ALAF Europe on the NGI Commons project, where the Linux Foundation Europe has been tasked with the very difficult task of trying to measure the impact of the NGI funding. So I've been working on that since March, and I'm also doing a lot of research from the ALAF side. I will try to put in some of the research findings and stats that I've come across, but all in all, I would like to talk about the kind of the strategic thinking behind how ALAF does digital commons and why it's important. To answer your question, digital commons for me, or the way that I like to conceptualize it, is going beyond the open source license. And I think maybe a good example would be Bitergia, because at the ALAF, there are times when companies internally are developing a product, which they then open source, or they started as an open source license, and then it's then decision makers of the company decide to adopt it to the Linux Foundation in order to go beyond the open source license, meaning they would like to get neutral governance, they would like more contribution diversity, they would like to de-risk the project, to not be the only company being liable for it, and so that they help the sustainability of that project. So for me, digital commons comes in as a very useful concept here to go beyond the license and think about the governance, the standards, and how actually companies and open source communities can come together and collaborate.
Great. So one of the goals of this session was to really make this kind of language and this way of thinking very relevant for a Linux Foundation audience. So you've mentioned how the LF has played a large role in stewarding kind of these open source collaborations, many of which have huge applications and underpin global digital infrastructure. Are there specific examples you could give of kind of projects that you think really are functioning as commons in practice, and do you see opportunities for the public sector to engage in some of those collaborations that the LF has supported?
Yes, it's going to be difficult to define them as digital commons because I'm sure some people might not think of them as digital commons, and one of the NGI Commons deliverable that we were doing, led by Valerian from CNRS, actually came to the conclusion that governance can look very different for the different open source projects. Some of it is kind of this volunteer-based community support that is driving the governance part, and then sometimes it's really companies. It's actually 4 or 5 big companies driving the governance part of it, meaning it's not one company contributing only. And so I have already touched upon the PyTorch one, and that's when I think when Meta adopted it to the Linux Foundation, even themselves, they weren't thinking that it's gonna have such a strong community around it. But it does seem like once it was adopted to the Linux Foundation, loads of other contributors came in, and it's now a very stable community, and is very much the first in the AI and ML space, even before the AI hype. Another example would be, again in AI, I'm sorry for the many references to AI, but Generative AI Commons is an initiative of the Linux Foundation. And I'm guessing that the word commons is deliberate here because, for example, one of the things that came out of that thing was the model openness framework, which I think is very useful. It's trying to not look at models in a binary way, whether something's open or not. It has 3 tiers, one being open models where the weights are open, second being open tooling where there's more control and kind of transparency around what the model does, and the third is the open science model when they even open source the data sets. And for me, that really helped thinking on, okay, there's other technologies out there where the open source definition and open source software definition is not going to work, one being this AI thing. And the model openness framework helped me kind of go beyond, okay, there's also these data sets, there's also a lot of other things that need to be open and transparent and so that people have the possibility to look into it, modify it, and the other 4 freedoms that open source software is about. And the previous discussion actually in this room was on neonifos, which is Paula is the one who really got it, showed it to me, and I started paying attention to neonifos coming out of the IPSAI CIS project that the Christian was telling us that it was 3.5 billion that the European Commission put aside for the specific project to be able to strengthen the cloud space in Europe and get more autonomy there. And the Neonifos Foundation started kind of hosting open source projects that would help that, many times actually working with the CNCF community, because a lot of the cloud native tools were already there, and those were that was a correct foundation to work from on. And so I think around March, they then decided to join the Linux Foundation Europe, which is again giving them a more boost into getting more companies and more contributors to that project.
Great. Daniel, I'm going to come to you next. We're talking a lot about kind of, big public policy ideas, big theories of change around, how to mobilize, attention and interest around kind of big applications of open source by the EU. But from your perspective, does this conversation around open source software and other open technologies in the public sector, does it create opportunities for developers? Like, what does it actually mean for the people that would be involved in these projects to have kind of, increased involvement from the public sector in kind of leading and stewarding and contributing to these projects?
So a bit, by the way, a bit of my background, coming from more technical perspective, computer science. So I was in the past developer, now mostly doing management and so on. But what we've seen lately is that there is a more and more interest, private sector, public administrations, on understanding specifically the maturity level of the projects they are adopting, coming specifically from the open source space. If we think about the history of European Commission, specifically where I come from, which is mainly a research space, they've been funding research and putting a certain amount of budget to understand how open source works. So I have past experience in FP7, FP6, Horizon, all of these projects that came back from 2007, 2008, 2009. Back in time, there was a whole bunch of projects trying to understand the economics of open source, to understand the stage of open source all around the world. For instance, one of the projects was Flossworld. I was involved in another one called Qualos, for instance, to produce quality models. So all of this is, I see this as a wave coming from the past to nowadays. The opportunities that, as I see, is basically all of this from a researcher perspective. What we were creating back in time is a body of knowledge that is publicly available, that then everyone can use and reuse for its different purposes. And then this is where we enter into how to use that knowledge to either create a new business, to create a better software, to bring certain processes, tools, etc., etc. So as a researcher or past researcher, I keep doing research. In any case, I see this as a place where you can find a motivation or knowledge gaps that can fill basically your full understanding of what you are trying to achieve. Try to be close to the edge of knowledge and try to produce new stuff that might be basically relevant for you, your corporation, your life, or the citizens as a public administration.
Mm-hmm. I mean, hopefully what we're going to see is, more experimentation and kind of more engagement from the public sector in these projects. So is there anything you've learned from your work with Bitergia or Chaos, for example, that you think is relevant for these type of commons like collaborations between, many different actors, not just the government, but also the community, private sector, civil society, etc.?
Let me bring anecdotal data, which is the life of the company of Bitergia. So we came from all of these projects, so then we had to produce tools to understand open source. So we were one of the first building the biggest database on open source all around the world. Yes, 2007, so that's way different from today's industry, right? But that was the starting point for us to say, well, what if we, build a company? And then it's true that we had not only that information or knowledge or software that, by the way, was open source, to start a company, that then we had some extra help from the government. So there is a certain support coming again from public administration, soft credits, etc., to make that happen. Technological transfer from the university. So there is a whole ecosystem all around this that is enabling you at some point to make the decision as an individual, basically, with other peers in this case, to make that happen. And that's basically, I would say, one of the roles of public administrations is how to make that space sustainable over time, but specifically attractive enough so others can basically replicate that same process. It's again anecdotal data, so that's my purely experience in the field. So going to the thing specifically, I would say that if we think about the whole journey of what we were producing back in time from a research perspective, we started in 2002. Then we produced something that was valuable enough to say we are starting a company in 2012, all based on research and knowledge aggregation, all of this. Then we were testing the market in 3-4 years, saying, okay, what does this concept of community metrics mean something for someone else out there? And then suddenly we realized that, for instance, Linux Foundation Insights decided to take the project, Grimoire Lab, back in time, and start producing Linux Foundation Insights based on this technology. And then suddenly we saw that OSS Compass, which is a Chinese project, decided to fork the project and produce another project on this. So what I mean is basically took a while to do the research, took a while to do to test the market, but suddenly in just a few months you have several options out there that are simply taking the technology, and all that work basically is bringing all that innovation like this. And that's basically the interesting part thing here.
Great, and based on all that kind of experience, like engaging with the public sector and engaging in these communities, are there any kind of patterns or specific lessons learned that you think policymakers should be considering when they decide how to contribute to, support, nurture these digital commons in a bit more of an intentional way?
What I have in mind are anti-patterns. One of those, for instance, is the example of the CRA. The CRA was a great example, and we have Mirko here that has been going around all the world. But it was a great example of not bringing the right players at the right time together to have such discussions. The very first version of the CRA was super scary for the open source industry, and basically all the software industry, because it's relying on open source, as we all know. That would have broken everything if this is not basically everyone is kind of running in circles like, hey, what's going on here? So then the European Commission started to listen to others and say, okay, that's true, that's fair. Okay, yes, we are entering, or we are now into a regulated market, and that's happening in any case. But then there is a space for the industry to simply keep moving forward. So I would say anti-patterns would be about avoiding not having the right people in the room when it's needed, basically.
Mm-hmm. So what we're really talking about is, the next version of NGI funding. We were in this room yesterday talking about the case for an EU sovereign tech fund. What's really different about what the NGI did is they really funded grassroots innovation, and while we don't exactly have a theory of change yet, we know that the open internet stack is something with decidedly a bit more ambition and maybe a bit more resources behind it. So what are the advantages and risks of new approaches like this approach to the open internet stack, or to the work the Digital Commons Edict are seeing? Like, when you think about kind of the worst case, like what would it look like for us to fail to learn some of the lessons from some of the collaborations that you all have talked about?
I don't know if you want to jump in the conversation. You want to?
Yeah, sure, but you can go ahead.
Okay. So let's start with the basics. So let's let's go with the classic books coming from Carl Fogel, okay, how to do open source and how to do open source for the industry, right, in a corporate environment. So you need to start thinking about some of the topics that you mentioned, right? We are thinking about the license, you need to have a communication channels, you need to have starting a community around this. So it's basically all with the purpose of having a common mission and vision to make that happen. The discussion here is about how to effectively engage public administrations, or the other way around, how to bring open source to public administrations flavor. And that's basically the challenge, I would say, because the private sector already knows how to do it. Some example is, if we go, for instance, to a PyTorch board members, you can see that all of them are vendors. Probably a government or public administration as end users should be there in somehow, because they have an opinion, they have a view, they would like to influence in somehow where things should go. So that's part of the discussion that at the high-level foundations should happen at some point, as with Linux Foundation. I assume you're already having this. And then in the more low level, basically producing code is how to enable, again, open source developers to be part of the journey together with public administrations, because the examples perhaps that we've seen once and again are perhaps too, how to say this, coming from research perspective, you only have to do a check, yeah, it's open source. And then it means that it's open source because it's basically in GitHub published, and then nothing else. No community, no maintenance, nothing else. It's simply abandoned there. So this is abandoned open source. It's no sense, right? But it makes sense from the public administration because they do a check. So then there are many challenges, I would say.
That's exactly what we don't want. So yeah, how do we avoid that? Adrienn, do you want to come in? Do you have any thoughts?
Yes, maybe just on, so for example, on the NGI funding program, which started in, Nick, can you please help me on when it started, the NGI funding program, exactly?
Mirko, correct me if I'm wrong, 2018?
Not the NGI Commons, but the NGI funding program.
I believe it was
itself.
2018.
Yeah.
I could be wrong.
Okay.
Pretty sure it's older, but I will look it up. Okay, go on. Yeah, all looking at me.
But so when, I believe in the NGI funding program, which I think is earlier than 2018, but Mirko is gonna get us the number. But one thing that I'm seeing through the NGI Commons work is that when NGI funding started, the abbreviation means Next Generation Internet. It was trying to get us to a human-centric internet where privacy is important, users have the freedom to choose what kind of what kind of technologies that they are using. So, for example, in the case of the social media, I think that's something easy because we are all using some, most probably, is to be able to say that, okay, if I don't want to use the ones from the big tech companies, are there any alternatives? So at that time, I think the goal was quite different than what I'm currently seeing in the European narrative, which is of course now focusing on digital sovereignty and digital autonomy. And so in my work, what has been quite, I would say, difficult is that first the funding program came up as something that's looking to get this kind of open source projects where the creators are very much passionate about that project. They would like to give alternatives. They would like to get us technologies which we trust and we would like to use, and we don't feel kind of logged into these kind of tech chambers and with all of that happens. And so, but through this shift, digital sovereignty will definitely mean that something that's kind of scalable, used by companies. And there's this, I think, commercial element that at the beginning wasn't there. And of course, it's really difficult to now assess these open source projects which receive funding. And for example, Macedon is one of them, is doing great work in giving us alternatives so that we can use it instead of the others. But at the same time, they didn't have that mechanism to scale. They are not able to currently give it to the millions of Europeans to use. It's not there. And so this is definitely a challenge when we're assessing these funding programs, when the different funding objectives are changing. And so we could, underestimate the success or the where these NGI funded projects went. And so with the open internet stack, I think one thing to learn there is it really, that's why I think important in the discussions of digital sovereignty are really what are we trying to do? Are we trying to, de-risk our technologies from other regions? If that's the main goal, then the funding program should be something that's scalable. Are we still kind of committed to those human-centric values that first the NGI program wanted to do? If so, then there will need to be definitely more strategic thinking around how are we going to do that and not, get European big tech companies as the alternative to the US big tech companies. So I think that's one thing that kind of needs to be commitment there and to lay out those values, which I think Digital Commons is doing a great job at, because that's where you can go from the open source license and into neutral governance, saying that, yes, I would like really this project to be de-risked from kind of everything else, and if there's a community around that, I would like that community to decide what the future of the technology is.
Yeah, and I think this is one of my theories around why there's not so much known about the open internet stack just yet, is that it seems like the Commission really wants to hear from the community and to hear more about what should be part of this kind of funding framework. And so I'm really interested to hear from you guys as we kind of like wrap up our panel discussion, and then we should take a question or two. Like, how can we kind of break this dependency of the public sector on a handful of suppliers? So like what I find a little bit problematic in kind of the buy European narrative is really that it doesn't kind of address some of the root causes of challenges that folks have in terms of lock-in and kind of in supply. So how can we ensure that procurement and sustainability models for these digital commons-based projects remain inclusive and non-extractive, and that we don't just kind of recreate the old paradigm, but with a European flavor, so to speak?
I go first, maybe. Okay, so my thoughts here are related mainly to what it seems that public administrations are not properly doing in the open source space. So we are, the very first thoughts that they were having basically is about, okay, we need to be open source, and then open source means that it has to be under a certain license. But then we are realizing that basically if there is no certain sustainability of the community, then we enter into the phase of, well, that means that there will not be community. So then who's going to take the role here, or the leadership role, into making this available for during the next years or so? We are now, for instance, I don't remember exactly the numbers, but if you think about the automotive industry, you build a car, you will take like 2-3 years to sell the car, and then you need to support the software for how many 10 or 15 years. That's a lot of time. So basically, are you sure that the technology that you are using, and specifically open source technology that you are using, is going to be around in 10-15 years? So then this is where private entities and public administrations, because at the end, public administrations, I would say, tend to be more conservative than private sector, because they have to serve the citizens at some point. So they need to be sure that whatever they have may not have everything, but it's working. Should have an open mind into bringing those extra digital commons, as we've been defining this, into consideration, including specifically community sustainability and the ecosystem around this. And then the next step is, well, if this exists and it's happening, then we enter into what is the commercial ecosystem, giving support to those public administrations around this, which is basically the corporate level who is giving the services to a public administration.
Adrienn, you want to come in?
Yeah, sure. I'm really not an expert on especially the whole stack of the technologies that are out there, but it was sorry?
No, me neither.
It's okay. And so in the EuroStack report, it's I don't know if you've seen that graphic on really starting from hardware all the way up to software and applications on what the full stack looks like, and how Europe will, through each of those stacks, build autonomy. Because I get what you're saying, Nick, is that if we have, maybe some autonomy around the application layer or around the software layer, but we're still logged into those hardware and chips and different things that are still part of the stack, then did we really achieve autonomy? And I'm really not an expert on this to say like which layer and what kind of independence and autonomy level we need to reach to be able to feel independent in Europe from other regions. But I think that's a good way to think about it, and that's why I think the technology building blocks is a good thing, where we have different layers and we are able to think about how these are connected and how one depends on the other.
Yeah, I presented a few examples that are more at the application layer, but what we tried to do was create a taxonomy that helps to, discover and look at capabilities across very different layers of the stack. And I think that's at the root of the conversation around digital autonomy, the idea that you can have strategic autonomy and that you can be resilient in the face of, have digital resilience, in the name of your forum, to in the face of some of these shocks. So yeah, that's kind of the goal of what we've promoted today. Does anyone have any questions from the audience? And I'll walk around. Wait, you hold on to that. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for this great discussion. My name is Claire Dillon. This question is coming from the Irish perspective. One of the talks earlier in this conference was by Johan Lineker and Sachiko about the public sector projects, and they highlighted the thing that I think some people have referenced here, that in public administrations and public sector, it's very rarely the actual staff of the public sector administrative body that are actually developing the thing. Like, they're always dependent, for most part, on suppliers, contractors, incumbents that have gone through their procurement process. So I'm just wondering, in the context of thinking about public sector admins being stewards or leaders or contributors, it's not them that's doing that, though. It's the people they procure through the system. And so I'm just wondering how that might change the vision of who exactly you're expecting to be sitting on the stewardship and advisory boards. Are they non-technical civil servants talking about public sector requirements, or are they going to be the technical people who are not sitting in, they're not public sector bodies at all? So I'm just kind of curious as how you're thinking about, like, the personal aspect of who will be doing this work if we have an ideal scenario.
I mean, to briefly answer myself, I'm much more optimistic on the member state level, because I think you see pockets of activity already happening, like with what the folks at the Center for Digital Sovereignty in Germany are doing, or what the folks at DNUM are doing. You see some of those capabilities moving in-house to the point where maybe they're not all developers, but they have the knowledge needed to engage with suppliers and to really do this work with the community in a much more intentional way. So I'm very encouraged by some of those examples. I haven't seen a lot of movement around that at the level of kind of European institutions quite yet. And so what you could see with the NGI program, or with the Open Internet Stack, is kind of a version of the NGI program that ends up becoming very reliant on those types of suppliers, or even just kind of relies on in-kind contributions from a number of SMEs. So I don't know. I'm a little bit torn. What do you guys think?
Well, I'm really not an expert in it, but what I've kind of heard from the procurement side is that there's even this problem of procurement still from the European government, procurement processes still favoring closed source options and not really, having that opportunity there where you could incentivize these governments and bodies to go out for open source technologies. It's not really there. I've heard some, I think, legal barriers there and why that can't happen. So I don't know what's the current reason, but even at that procurement level, there's a lot of barriers where even if they wanted to, even if we got to a place where for some reason public servants are advocating for open source and want to say that I would like to use open source tools and I would like that to be adopted by the government, there seems to be also some procurement barriers there as well.
Just a quick comment here, and my experience specifically in Spain, where I come from, is that there's a lot to do in terms of education process for the people that are making the decisions, and those are the director level or management level in public administrations. And I've had conversations where they don't really fully understand what open source is, and what are the options that they have if they are asking their providers or suppliers to start using open source in terms of decision-making power, cost perhaps, and variety of options in the market. And that's basically my 2 cents basically to the conversation.
I would also just add, I did a research study which will hopefully soon be published by the Open Source Observatory on OSS in local cities and regions. And what I'm really seeing is a high level of kind of capabilities moving in-house in cities and regions, and a lot of really innovative and constructive activity happening. So I'm hoping that there can be a conversation between different levels of government, particularly in the member states, and that a lot of this collaboration can be guided through and channeled through the edict, so that it can be really kind of a decentralized and kind of grassroots effort, and it's not just something being imposed by the Commission from the top down. Anyone else have any questions?
let's first add to the assumption that there are barriers in open source procurement. There are none. Public bodies can procure open source. I'm, as also Claire knows, working on a lot of instruments on how you can procure open source within the current models. The issue, to add to Claire's question, what you see is that my experience is, and I'm working on procurement, open source procurement actively for my ministry. I'm also helping others. Currently working on a procurement where we procure identity management system, where we have different, we want to procure the services, the implementation, further development. But then again, on the other hand, you need companies that are willing to cooperate together and to conform to the legal aspects of what procurement is. So on the one hand, you have a public body like I'm trying to procure open source, and then on the other hand, not having the certainty that parties are actually willing to win the procurement because of all kinds of how to say it, idealistic issues. We have certain rules to follow, and the others should as well make and meet us in the middle.
Thank you.
What do you guys think?
Yes, I mean, you just told me how the procurement works, and it's very helpful for me to know that it seems like it's not coming from the public body's side in terms of the procurement process itself. It might be coming from, I guess, personal and strategic ideas.
It's both. There are no legal obligations to procure open source.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I'm saying, and that's what the assumption was there are none.
Mm-hmm.
The issue is not having the, for example, can I have the mic again? So there was an article in Dutch newspaper in which the high-speed train tracks from the Netherlands to Belgium was built by a consortium of big companies, big construction companies, and they were in a legal discussion with the ministry, saying it doesn't work properly. I didn't care about the legal stuff. I just read there is a consortium of construction companies working together, building a road track, and I don't see those cooperations in certain open source software or around open source software. The thing I'm talking about is Midpoint. I don't see it around a Nextcloud with LibreOffice with. So actually having a decent alternative in cooperation within a foundation or something for legal, for public offices, that we have one phone number that we can call, and then the guy or the woman that picks up the phone number says, okay, Nextcloud, this is your issue. The document foundation, this question is for you guys. And that's what I'm missing here. And that's what the risk is from a public body, that you need somebody that you can call and that is willing to address the issue for the next 15 years, as you said. And if the Nextcloud guys steps out of it or goes bankrupt, that there is another party that can step in, and that we as a public body don't care who that is, as long as it's serviced.
But that risk exists in any case. I mean, you have that even with private companies. You have a company that may go bankrupt, and I mean, so the risk is exactly the same.
That's why you're almost the incumbents, right? Too big to fail.
Yeah.
So I think we're just about at time, but maybe we have time for one very, very brief question.
I have a question, but it's not brief.
Anyone have a very brief question?
My question is not that brief, but how do you push your government and municipalities and local states to adopt and want to adopt open source? My government, the Swedish government specifically, and the local municipalities are not even willing to think about open source, basically.
Mhm.
So, what can we do, and how can we push that narrative so they adopt it and want to adopt it?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the answer is attending events like this and the movement around OSPOs. I think, no, but I mean, there is a huge relationship between these OSPOs and these public infrastructure efforts. There's an event in Brussels that's actually being convened by the state of Schleswig-Holstein next week, and I really see that type of capacity and capability building as being really important too, because like if you know, the EU funds these types of projects and these types of collaborations, it doesn't really mean anything if governments and cities and regions aren't able to actually adopt them. But yeah, do you guys have any final thoughts before we jump off?
But yes, so thank you so much for your contributions. So since I'm coming from a research side, it's always, of course, we're seeing the challenges, we're seeing what we would like to see, and of course the biggest question is how do we then make it happen? What's the kind of level that we need to go to? Who are the decision makers we need to kind of prioritize influencing? And that's also something that I haven't really come to a conclusion yet. I'm still learning through the NGI Commons on how the EC can be influenced, and there are times when I'm not sure whether that's the best way or not. We are, as a consortium at the NGI Commons, working on deliverables, hopefully trying to make that shift, that policy change, and working on the impact of the NGI funding. But that's just very, like, funding is a big part, but as Paloma said in another panel, it's not everything, and there needs to be a lot of, for example, on-paid support guarantees on open source software, so that public bodies, since they can, actually decide to procure.
I never met anyone in my government and on the high strategic level that doesn't want to procure open source. They all want to procure open source, but open source can't deliver on their side, on services, on corporations, and those aspects. They can't.
Well, one of the things we see happening through the Digital Commons Edict, or that I've heard kind of rumors of at least, is that they really want to polish up and kind of bring up to, you know, enterprise level some of these open source collaborations and really, really make them usable by governments, so that it's, you know, not janky, that it's really just something that is easy to adopt and implement and has some level of support from behind it. I haven't seen the level of you know, funding there to actually do that, but I think that that's the kind of hope or kind of the best case option of this type of collaboration. I do have to kind of finish up now because I think we're at time, but I would say that there's going to be 2 opportunities, hopefully, to engage with this project going forward around this. So we'll have a policy summit in November. I believe right now it's currently called the NGI Policy Summit, but we're going to try and call it the Digital Commons Policy Summit because the NGI is going away. And as part of that, there's also going to be a convening of the Digital Commons Edict, both in Brussels, and so we're really hoping that that'll be a great opportunity to involve the community. So if you'd like to, you know, support this effort, provide your thoughts, feedback, please get in touch with myself, Nicholas at openforumeurope.org, or you can follow NGI Commons on various social media channels. And yeah, we'll be continuing to develop this type of thinking and provide feedback through the NGI Commons CSA. Any final comments from you, Daniel or Adrienn?
No, just going to your question before, I would say yes, the people. We need more people, critical mass within public administration that, yeah, think that this is the process to follow. So, yeah, more advocates.
Okay, thank you all.